Right now, millions of Americans are falling behind, and they are doing everything right. They aren't losing their jobs, they aren't making reckless financial gambles, and they aren't falling for obvious scams. They are simply waking up, going to work, paying their bills, and showing up for their families. Yet, at the end of every single month, they find themselves coming up shorter than the month before. This isn't a failure of personal responsibility. It is the silent math of a systemic squeeze, a single geopolitical and economic catalyst, one that the vast majority of people in this country have never had a reason to contemplate, is currently triggering a simultaneous contraction across energy markets, agricultural production, and household budgets. It isn't hitting one sector today and another tomorrow. It is hitting all of them at once. And when cost pressures compound across every foundational layer of daily life, simultaneously, the concept of a good month to catch up completely evaporates. There are no easy lifestyle adjustments left to make when the baseline cost of existence absorbs the entirety of your paycheck. The financial margin that separates stability from insolvency is simply disappearing. To understand how a family in Ohio or Georgia is suddenly unable to afford their routine grocery bill, we have to look at a body of water most Americans only know from high school geography maps. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow, strategically volatile maritime choke point, wedged between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. On a standard map, it looks insignificant, a mere blue thread separating massive land masses. But global trade does not care about visual scale, it cares about throughput. Under normal global conditions, roughly 1/5 of the world's total petroleum supply passes through this exact corridor every single day. It is the jugular vein of the global energy economy. When regional military conflicts and heightened asymmetric threats sharply reduce commercial traffic through the strait, earlier this year, the global energy markets reacted instantly. Brent crude didn't creep upward. It surged, hitting $138 a barrel on April 7th and maintaining an exhausting average of $117 throughout the entire month. There is a comforting myth floating around American political discourse that makes a lot of people feel safe, and it is entirely wrong. The narrative says that because the United States has achieved historic levels of domestic oil production, what happens in the Persian Gulf is ultimately someone else's problem. It suggests that American energy independence acts as a kinetic shield, insulating domestic prices from a crisis unfolding 7,000 miles away. But that is not how liquid commodity markets function. American refineries do not operate in a vacuum. They exist within a hyper-connected, globalized pricing architecture. A barrel of diesel refined on the Gulf Coast is tied to the price of diesel in Rotterdam or Singapore. When maritime tanker insurance premiums skyrocket in the Middle East, global shipping rates climb universally. When global trade routes are forced to bypass choke points and reroute around entire continents, the time, fuel, and capital required to move goods increase exponentially. Someone has to absorb that premium. Ultimately, a disruption in a distant desert waterway invariably manifests as a fuel surcharge on a grain farm in Iowa or a logistics invoice at a delivery hub in Georgia. Distance has been rendered irrelevant by global commerce. The cost always finds its way to the consumer. In response to this brewing storm, policy levers like summer fuel waivers are often introduced to inject temporary flexibility into the domestic gasoline market. While these regulatory adjustments help on the absolute fringes, they cannot physically dredge a blocked international shipping lane, nor can they magically replace lost physical supply. They certainly cannot reverse the inflationary ripples that have already embedded themselves into the balance sheets of every industry reliant on petroleum derivatives. The immediate threat facing the average citizen isn't a cinematic apocalypse where gas stations suddenly run completely dry. The real danger is a grinding, unpredictable volatility that paralyzes economic planning. When corporate supply chains and independent small businesses have no baseline predictability for what their energy inputs will cost next month, they stop absorbing the risk. They protect their survival by quietly raising prices across the board today, building a defensive buffer against the unknown tomorrow. This hidden energy premium doesn't stop at the commercial transport sector. It actively burrows into the very dirt beneath our feet, quietly rewriting the economics of American agriculture long before the product ever reaches a suburban supermarket scanner. The systemic pressure radiating from the Strait of Hormuz does not stop at coastal oil terminals or industrial distribution hubs. It actively penetrates the domestic food supply chain, transforming American agricultural fields into high-risk logistics operations. Modern industrial farming depends directly on heavy petrochemical inputs. Every acre of commercial grain, corn, or produce requires a sequence of diesel-powered machinery, intensive chemical applications, and long-haul transportation. When energy prices surge, the foundational costs of growing food escalate long before a single crop is harvested or processed. A clear indicator of this structural strain emerged from recent agricultural field assessments and industrial surveys encompassing more than 5,700 independent American farmers. The collected data shows that approximately 70% of commercial agricultural operators could no longer afford to purchase their baseline fertilizer volumes for the current season. This deficit stems directly from the fact that farm-grade diesel prices surged 46% immediately, following the initial maritime transport disruptions in late February. Concurrently, broader operational assessments confirmed that nearly 6 in 10 domestic farmers experienced a measurable decline in their net financial stability compared to the previous calendar year. These localized financial stresses do not instantly change retail food availability, because agricultural supply chains operate with extended structural delays. Independent farmers manage rising operational costs through immediate tactical reductions. To protect their immediate cash reserves, they intentionally cut back on total nutrient applications, leave marginal acreage unplanted, delay critical mechanical maintenance, and expand their existing commercial credit lines. While these choices keep farms functioning in the short term, they systematically reduce long-term agricultural productivity. Lower fertilizer utilization directly reduces the total crop yield per acre, while unplanted acreage creates an aggregate supply deficit that moves through regional distribution systems over the following 6 to 9 months. A definitive case manifests within the central Kansas grain belt, where winter wheat operations require major upfront capital investments every autumn. By early spring, standard operational invoices for diesel, bulk nitrogen solutions, and seed treatments escalated beyond the cash reserves of typical family-owned enterprises. In major producing zones, operators were forced to reduce their standard fertilizer applications by 1/3 to avoid defaulting on equipment financing agreements. This shift represents a calculated commercial compromise forced by an unyielding macroeconomic climate rather than poor individual management. When replicated across hundreds of thousands of individual farms, these adjustments compound inside the broader processing economy. The cost increases flow steadily from regional grain elevators into commercial flour mills, industrial food manufacturing plants, and regional fulfillment centers before finally reaching retail inventory systems. The initial farm-level operational decisions become completely obscured by the time a finished product arrives on a supermarket shelf. The final consumer simply observes an incremental price increase, unaware of the structural supply shocks that initiated the adjustment months earlier. The current agricultural cycle is colliding with structural production deficits that leave no room to absorb these elevated input costs. The United States Department of Agriculture issued official crop production forecasts showing that the total domestic winter wheat harvest is projected at approximately 990 million bushels. This volume represents a severe 29% drop compared to the 1.4 billion bushels harvested during the previous operational year. This contraction marks one of the lowest domestic winter wheat yields recorded in more than half a century, driven by persistent regional droughts across the high plains and reduced overall planting acreage. Brownfield Ag News Issue 1. While a 29% drop in winter wheat volume does not imply immediate physical shortages or empty retail shelves, it fundamentally alters the pricing structure of basic food manufacturing. Wheat serves as the primary base ingredient for an extensive matrix of consumer goods, including commercial flour, industrial baking supplies, packaged cereals, dry pasta, processed proteins, and livestock feed mixtures. A sharp contraction in this primary commodity instantly transmits upward pricing pressure across dozens of distinct grocery categories simultaneously. The primary danger of these agricultural shocks lies in their prolonged, backloaded timeline. Food processors initially fulfill commercial orders using pre-existing supply contracts and deep grain reserves stored in regional elevators. As those cheaper inventories are depleted over several months, food manufacturers must purchase new raw materials at the prevailing higher market rates. Distributors subsequently adjust their wholesale pricing models, and corporate grocers pass the accumulated expenses down to the consumer level. Consequently, the price increases currently being locked into commercial logistic contracts will continue to manifest at the retail checkout counter well into the next winter season. The agricultural and energy bottlenecks converging across the domestic economy are further compounded by a critical supply crisis developing within the industrial manufacturing and transportation sectors. Modern internal combustion engines, long-haul commercial trucks, agricultural machinery, and industrial logistics fleets rely directly on high-performance synthetic lubricants to maintain continuous operations. These advanced lubricants are formulated using Group 3 base oils, which are highly refined petroleum derivatives required to meet modern environmental and mechanical efficiency standards. Commercial logistics data confirms that the United States remains a net importer of these critical base stocks, traditionally relying on external production to cover 50 to 70% of total domestic demand. Middle East Lubricants Issue, One Industrial Supply Chain Tracking reports show that approximately 55% of all United States Group 3 base oil imports originated directly from dedicated refining complexes located within the Persian Gulf region. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the subsequent declaration of force majeure by major regional producers completely severed these established supply lines. Shipments from major international facilities, including a primary 1.3 million metric ton per year high-performance refining asset in Qatar, halted entirely due to the suspension of commercial maritime insurance coverage in the conflict zone. Powershed.com.au. Show 1. This sudden contraction created an immediate structural deficit within the domestic lubricant market, causing spot availability for specialized synthetic base stocks to effectively disappear by late spring. While domestic petrochemical manufacturers are actively expanding processing capacity within the United States, adding advanced hydrocracking infrastructure requires years of capital investment and engineering deployment rather than months. This deficit exposes a major structural vulnerability regarding crude oil production metrics. Although the United States extracts record volumes of raw domestic crude, raw petroleum cannot be directly substituted for highly specialized, chemically altered industrial lubricants. Nation can possess an aggregate surplus of raw energy while simultaneously experiencing a severe shortage of the refined chemical inputs necessary to operate its primary distribution machinery. Jobs World. Issue 1. The practical manifestations of this lubricant deficit are propagating rapidly through the domestic maintenance and transport sectors. Commercial vehicle repair facilities report extended delivery delays for high-volume, low-viscosity engine oils, such as 0W20 formulations, which are standard across modern commercial delivery fleets and passenger vehicles. Industrial blenders face unstructured and volatile pricing shifts, with the wholesale cost of remaining Group 3 spot inventories escalating far more rapidly than standard crude oil indices. Fleet operators are forcing extended maintenance intervals or utilizing alternative specifications where regulatory frameworks allow, which increases the long-term risk of mechanical degradation across commercial transport networks. Jobs World Show 1. This industrial bottleneck aligns with a broader contraction in consumer purchasing power as summer seasonal utility demands begin to take effect. Official energy infrastructure projections indicate that the average residential electricity rate across the United States has reached 18.2 cents per kilowatt-hour, reflecting a definitive 5% increase over the previous calendar year. The most severe rate escalations are heavily concentrated along the dense metropolitan corridors of the Atlantic seaboard, where local distribution grids face elevated structural transmission costs and shifting generation mix expenses. The timing of this utility cost expansion exacerbates existing household budget deficits. As peak summer temperatures drive continuous cooling demands, residential electricity consumption scales up mechanically. The regional utility invoice operates independently of external household pressures. It does not adjust for the reality that a consumer is spending more on basic food staples, nor does it discount its rates because a family is carrying unresolved vehicle repair balances on commercial credit lines. These essential expenses do not arrive in isolation. They stack chronologically, forming an unyielding financial baseline that systematically strips away flexible household income. The structural division within the domestic consumer economy is reflected clearly in modern retail spending metrics. For households possessing substantial liquid savings or stable asset bases, an incremental increase in utility costs or fuel surcharges represents a manageable operational annoyance. However, for the demographic segment comprising lower-wage workers, long-distance commuters, and fixed-income retirees, these overlapping cost increases trigger a cascading series of budget reallocations. When the fixed costs of commuting, housing, and utilities absorb an expanding percentage of net take-home pay, the flexible